This week, we're going to continue with the thought that we started last week about Ezekiel's vision that he has right at the very beginning of the book of this four-headed creature within a wheel within a wheel. And he sees this vision. This vision's gotten a lot of acclaim, a lot of interest. And so I want to perhaps shed a little light to the best that I can to help clarify the interpretation of this passage. So in the previous video, we talked about how that four-headed creature is really a representation of Israel and Israel's original encampment while Moses was leading them, right? And so that four-headed creature represents Israel. So the question we want to address in this video is, what was the wheel within the wheel? And so there are two clues to this passage. The first one comes in looking at the prophetic wording, the apocalyptic wording, if you will, of the vision. It says, covering the wheel within the wheel were all of these eyes. And so typically in apocalyptic literature, when you see something covered with eyes, it speaks to a multitude of people, perhaps nations, that kind of thing. So what we have here is Israel in the center, right, surrounded by this vision of a wheel within a wheel, which seems to be representing nations of some sort, right? Then when God, in chapter 4 and 5, right in that range, the Lord comes in and begins to speak, and he begins to give an interpretation of what Ezekiel has seen and talking to him about why he has shown him this vision. And in it, the Lord, I believe, gives a clue about the meaning of this vision. He says that Israel was supposed to be an example to the people around, but because Israel has fallen into idolatry, that the surrounding nations also are idolatrous, and that Israel has become like them, which is kind of an interesting phrase, because in the vision that Ezekiel sees, the four-headed creature and the wheel within a wheel, it says, were of the same spirit. And we'll talk about that here in a second. So getting back to the wheel within a wheel, if you go through and were to teach this book of Ezekiel, you would begin to see that after this vision, all the way up until about chapter 32, that's when chronologically the temple is destroyed and the tone of the book begins to change from one of prophetic judgment that's coming to one of restoration and hope. Now that the temple's actually fallen, then from then on out, Ezekiel starts talking about restoring things, and God's giving him visions that are of a good future. But up until that point, from the time of this vision till the time of about chapter 32, we get God's prophetic warnings, and they begin with the house of Israel, and he starts talking about judgment that's going to come on Judah and all of the nation, and how the temple is going to be destroyed. All of that is prophesied. And then he gets into this section, and it's a two-part section where he deals with surrounding nations that are also going to fall under judgment at the same time as Israel, right? And so if you were to follow around a map, as God is dealing with these first section, it is the nations right around Israel. So think Moab, Ammon, Edom, all along the east side. And then you've got the north side of Tyre and Sidon and the Philistines and Egypt. And so you've got the first prophetic judgment that falls on the enemy nations, falls in a nice tight circle all the way around Israel. So the first half of the judgments on these enemy nations is really a circle all the way around Israel of every nation that is touching Israel geographically. Then he goes into a second section where it's an outer group of nations like Babylon and Assyria that will also fall because they are connected with this entire judgment that the Lord is sending out. And he gives reasons for each one of them. But if you follow the course of the book, it starts with Israel being judged. Then there is a circle of nations immediately around Israel that are judged, and then another circle around them that are judged as well. And so it kind of goes in these concentric circles, beginning with Israel in the middle, then going to the nations directly touching Israel, and then the surrounding nations. And so the idea, I believe, of this passage is that God is saying in the vision that they were supposed to be of one spirit, that as Israel goes, so goes the surrounding nations, and that they were to be a light to the world, in fact, that God's original plan for Israel was that they would live holy so that the surrounding nations would begin to honor and revere the Lord, and then these surrounding nations then would give God glory because of the blessing that was falling on Israel. And so because Israel fell into idolatry, the nations were not convicted, they did not come to the Lord, There was nothing special about Israel because Israel had fallen into idolatry just like the surrounding nations. And so instead of the surrounding nations being blessed because of Israel's righteousness, right, the surrounding nations were judged as well because of Israel's idolatry. As Israel fell, then all of the surrounding nations fell as well. And so I believe what God is showing in the beginning of this book of Ezekiel is the prophetic word, the vision, if you will, that guides the understanding of the entire book. That Israel, the four-headed creature, was placed right in the center of all of these surrounding nations. Remember, it said that these wheels had eyes that were watching the four-headed creature, and that they were all of one spirit. Wherever the four-headed creature went, the nations went that were surrounding it, the wheel within a wheel. And so I believe what God is saying is that He had placed Israel right in the center of these nations to be an influence, to be a light, to be a sign of God's glory and God's righteousness. But because Israel fell into idolatry, the same judgment that fell on Israel eventually began to fall upon all of the surrounding nations. And then that is essentially the message of the book of Ezekiel, is that judgment is coming on Israel and then progressively on the surrounding nations. And so I believe the vision given at the beginning is the clue to understanding the entire then teaching part of the whole rest of the book, which is that because Israel has fallen, so will everyone else that is connected to Israel, and that they never were converted because Israel never stood for righteousness like they were supposed to. So I believe that is the perhaps best way. I don't want to say it's the only way, because you'll read a lot of scholars that perhaps think differently, but I believe this gives a good framework for understanding what God is trying to say. And if you go back in and read around chapters 4 and 5, when God begins to talk about this vision, I believe it will become clear to you that this really is the focus of the whole book, is that because Israel was not the light they were supposed to be, it has now affected everything around them. And I believe that is the understanding of the vision of the four-headed creature within the wheel within the wheel.